Moving on to the next speaker. I'd like to introduce Dusita De Hoop from SkyNRG. She's also a partner in the HIGFLY project. Dusita studied chemical engineering, University of Delft, did a PDeng, then moved to SkyNRG and is now heavily involved in how to get deployment of the sustainable aviation fuels, how to get that working. So the floor is yours.
All right, I hope it works. Yeah, it does. Hi, I'm Dusita De Hoop, or also you might know me by Daisy as well. So I'm working for SkyNRG, and today I'll be presenting mainly on the topic of sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. So we'll be talking mainly about what SAF is, why it's important, and also how the SAF industry is looking like today as well, and what is needed to get it to scale up and deploy to the amount of volumes that we actually need to decarbonize. So just a little background on SkyNRG. We were originally a fuel supplier and trader, but now we want to move up the production stream and produce our own SAF. So now we're a capacity developer, developing multiple projects in both the EU, the US, and also all around the world. But we are still sourcing our SAF from third parties to supply to aircraft operators and airlines. In addition to that, we also provide solutions for individual travelers and also corporates who are looking to reduce their carbon footprint. And because we're in the SAF industry, we have more than 10 years of experience in the field. We're using our knowledge also to provide advisory services as well. But what is the most important is that sustainability is really at the core of what we do. We have an independent sustainability board that works with local NGOs and local communities as well that help make company decisions to make sure that we are truly sustainable. As I mentioned before, we have more than 10 years of experience in the industry, and we started out in 2019 where we supplied the first batch of SAF for the first commercial flight. By 2011, we successfully supplied SAF to all the continents. And by 2016, we established a long-term continuous supply of SAF at LAX in California. And by 2021, we announced the first SAF-dedicated facility in Europe. And by 2020, we've launched multiple SAF capacity projects in both the EU and in the US. And most recently, in 2023, we raised investments with Macquarie Capital, where their investments will be used for the development expenditures of SkyNRG. So we talked about SAF. So why is SAF so important? If you look at our current trajectory now, aviation emissions are bound to increase. And now the aviation industry has set a target to reach net zero emissions in 2050. So how can we do this? One of the things that you can do is carbon offsets and carbon capture, and that will play a role. However, there's only so much carbon capture and offsets that you can do. Other ways to reduce emissions include efficiency improvements of the current aircrafts, but that can only contribute also a small amount. But there are also things such as new propulsion technologies. However, these technologies will play an important role more in the long term. They're still currently being developed, and they're not ready for deployment. SAF is the most effective way to reduce carbon emissions in the short term and in the medium term. And the reason for this is that SAF is a drop-in fuel. This means that you don't require any infrastructural changes or changes to the current turbines. It is commercially deployed and it's ready to be scaled up, which is why SAF is expected to grow. The market itself is expected to grow really rapidly in the next coming years as well. So what is SAF and how can it be produced? SAF can be produced in three main buckets of feedstock. The first is fats and oils. This is through typically a production of removing the oxygen in fatty acids, and you get SAF. The second is through biomass, where you can typically gasify, get syngas, and run it through the Fischer-Tropsch, or you can also use the feedstock to produce alcohols and produce SAF through the alcohol-to-jet process. And lastly, you can also produce eSAFs, which is the combination of CO2 and energy, or used for the production of green hydrogen. And typically, these three feedstocks differ in their technology readiness and the feedstock availability as well. So currently, most of the SAF we see today in the market is SAF produced by the HEFA pathway, which is the first one. However, yeah, it's a commercially available technology, but there is limited feedstock. There's a limited amount of waste oils and fats that you can source in the world. However, if we move on to biomass, the technology is less technologically ready, but there is more feedstock available. And if you move to the last bucket in eSAF, in theory, there's infinite amount of renewable energy and carbon dioxide. So there is a high feedstock availability, but of course the technology is also the least technologically developed. So this here is a world map showing where the SAF mandates and targets have been announced, under discussion, or proposed. If I showed this picture a couple of years ago, you'll probably see only Europe and the US being highlighted. So yeah, the world is moving very rapidly, and only in the past couple of years, more and more countries have really announced their ambition to add SAF to their national targets. Especially in Asia. Asia is also an area that is moving very rapidly, and countries like Japan and China are also one of those that are, we expect to have a very strong mandate upcoming as well. So at SkyNRG, we publish a market outlook every year, and in this market outlook, we keep track of all the upcoming renewable diesel and SAF facilities that have been announced globally. And what we do is that once we identify these facilities, we exclude announcements with low probability of reaching production. This means announcements that are in feasibility stage, we remove them. Announcements with categorized high compounds of risk as well. And using publicly known information, we estimate the SAF output that can be expected from these facilities. And by doing so, we can estimate what the expected SAF capacity will be in the coming years. So this shows the output of the market outlook, and in this graph, it shows the European SAF capacity by technology up until 2030. And you can also see the light gray bar chart behind the bar chart. That is the European mandate that is being implemented. One key thing to note is that the European mandate starts in 2025, and there is also a sub-mandate for eSAFs that is separate from the mandate of all the other pathways, and that's given in the dotted line above the gray chart as well. So one key thing that you can see here is that we'll likely meet the mandates. And that will be met with the HEFA pathway, so that's using the feedstocks of waste oils and fats. However, it is also important to note that to meet the mandates, all these announcements, so 70% of these announcements will actually have to materialize. Another thing to note is that the dark blue line that you see at the bottom of the graph is co-processing volumes. Typically, a lot of refiners who perform co-processing do not announce that they are performing co-processing. So this volume can also change the entire supply structure that is shown here. One key thing to also note is that there is, you might already notice, but there is not a lot of green in the chart. So that is SAF produced from advanced biopathways. And it's also a very small portion also coming from eSAFs as well. However, you can expect to see the first of its kind commercial facility of both advanced biosaf and eSAF in the coming years. Although it's small, it's still there. So at SkyNRG, we kept track of the announcements already for the past couple years, so we're able to see what are the changes in the announcement that has been happening through the years. And to meet the mandates, we actually have to produce SAF. And currently, only 30% of the announcements or the estimates here are facilities that are either operational or under construction. If you don't have steel in the ground, you're not producing SAF. And what we see is that every year, this curve is getting pushed back. This means that more facilities are announcing cancellations or delays. However, you also observe a higher SAF capacity by 2030 as well. And this chart, or our estimates, have been made in June, and a lot of changes has actually occurred since then. There has been a lot of cancellations and delays that have been announced, not just in the EU, but also globally as well. And I think closer to home, one of the big news that we saw was Shell announcing that they're delaying their HVO and HEFA facility that was supposed to start up in 2025. And that portion that they're produced was actually quite a large portion of SAF that was expected in the market as well. Another project that was delayed is also UPM, who were looking for also a facility in Rotterdam as well. And typically the reasons for delays is that they're waiting certainty, not only for policy, but also the demand certainty. And you can say, well, okay, there is the European mandate, which should give certainty for producers who are looking to produce SAF. However, if you remember the graph from the last slide, if you look at 2025, if all the facilities materialize then, there's actually an oversupply of SAF. And now, what to do if you're a producer and you're looking to produce SAF? There is no more demand certainty when it's above the mandate. And aside from that, a lot of facilities also face challenges in terms of financing and also technical difficulties. And in the end, this stresses also the importance of the role of policy and how policy influences SAF production. Policy in the end is needed to give investors certainty that when the construction is built, there is a market for the product and there is a demand. So in the end, the key message is that stable policy is needed if we really want the facilities to be constructed. So if we zoom out a little bit more, this is the same graph, but instead of for the EU, this is the global SAF capacity. IATA has a 2030 goal of reaching 19 million tons of SAF. And if we reach 19 million tons, we're on track to meeting the 2050 net zero targets. So from what you already see from the graph, we're a little bit short of this target, but I think we're still on our way. And similarly to the European graph, the SAF being produced is still dominated by HEFA as well. But a little bit different, you do see that there is more variations in the types of technologies that is being produced SAF. So you see that there is quite the growth of alcohol to jet is happening as well, and that is in the orange bar. And this is typically happening mainly in the US. However, the feedstock that the US uses is agricultural feedstocks such as corn and sugarcane ethanol. So it's not a surprise that the US can scale up this pathway quite quickly because they have the feedstock and they already have the supply chains for these feedstocks in place. And a lot of the HEFA projects here that we observe also has a vegetable oil fallback option. In the case that if they don't have sufficient waste oils, they will fall back to vegetable oils. What this means is now, in this graph, more than half the SAF, the estimated capacity of SAF could be from agricultural feedstocks. And in general, there is still very limited advanced biosafs and eSafs that are upcoming in the future. And it's really important to get investments in to get these facilities start up early because we want them to be ready to be scalable when we need it to be. And this can be seen in this chart here, where this is the potential global SAF capacity from 2030 to 2050. In this graph, we did modeling. So we modeled the technology deployment rate based on the S-curve of the corn ethanol deployment rate in the US. And on top of the deployment rate, we did put on feedstock constraints as well. So what we see is that in 2030 to 2035, the HEFA pathway is still the main source of SAF. However, post-2035, it's really important for the other pathways to come into play and really get those SAF volumes in. And the reason for this is that there is limited feedstock supply of the HEFA pathways, and that's typically waste oils and fats. And of course, there are also new options of bio-oil coming from, let's say, cover crops, but there is still limited volumes there. So after 2035, we really need a rapid scale-up of all the other pathways, and this won't happen without policy support. For example, currently in the SAF mandate, there is no distinguishing factor between HEFA pathways and the advanced bioroutes. And it's difficult for the advanced bioroutes to compete with the HEFA pathway because it's just an easier process to produce the product. But we need a stronger policy push if we want these pathways to really materialize in the coming years. There's also news in the last year of Clariant closing down their second generation ethanol facility as well, and also Fulcrum's waste-to-jet facility that has closed. So this has also sent a negative signals to investors who are looking to invest into other production pathways as well. We really need that investment coming in, and I think policy will play an important role, if I haven't stressed that enough already, a really important role in getting these pathways in. But of course, policy is important, but as we saw from the previous presentation, feedstock's also very important. We have to make sure that the feedstock is there when we need it to be, and the scaling up these pathways are essentially contingent in having enough feedstocks. So what would the feedstock look like if we were to produce SAF in 2050? Aviation would have to claim 20% of the global feedstock. Of course, this is a rough estimate, and the total feedstock shown here are not the feedstocks available today either, which means that we have to unlock this potential, which has already been discussed in the previous presentation, but it often involves developing better management practices and also the supply chain to make sure that these feedstocks can be collected and sent to the facilities that need to use them. In addition to this, other things to consider is also competition. If aviation needs to claim 20%, how difficult would that be? There's a lot of competition, especially for biomass in the marine sectors, the chemical industry, and also the heat and energy sector as well. And in the end, who gets what is really dependent on the willingness to pay. And a lot of the times, policy, again, plays an important role in determining who has that power to spend their money on the feedstock. And among this, there's also other ways that you can also alleviate feedstock pressure, and that's actually through technology development. If you increase feedstock flexibility of each technology pathways, it makes it easier to gather more feedstock for a certain process. Or if you also improve carbon efficiencies or the efficiencies of the technology in general as well, it also alleviates the feedstock pressure. And I think this stresses also the importance of R&D projects like HIGFLY that is looking into new production routes, valorizing new types of feedstock as well. And in the end, I think you need everything. There is no one solution. We need a bit of everything. There is not enough of a single feedstock, so you'll have to use everything that we can get our hands on. So in general, to summarize everything, to be able to get a market deployment of SAF in the short term, we need to improve the certainty of supply. So this means having sub-targets and mandates for advanced biofuels and eSAF. We have to reduce investment risk to make sure that these facilities that are being planned will actually get FID and get constructed. And meeting the long-term targets, we have to make sure that there is enough pathways. We have to diversify the SAF production pathways as well, increasing the pool of feedstock to make sure that enough SAF can be produced. We need more SAF technological developments, such as increasing the efficiency and the flexibility of the process. But also an important part is securing the feedstock. we need the development of these supply chains that produce biomass feedstocks, but also policies that really support the development of biomass as well. And yeah, thank you. And if you're interested in our market outlook, so the slides that I've shown you so far is just a small portion of our market outlook. You can download it on our website, and it's publicly available as well. Yeah. Yeah. Any questions?
So thanks very much, Dusita, also for keeping the time very well. So we have time, so it's also an example. We have time for a few questions maybe.
Yeah. Yes.
I see a hand there.
Very clear, very nice presentation. Thank you very much for it. The mandate is a beautiful tool to push technologies and deployment, but it's also pushing the cost to the consumer, to the passenger. Now, do you have an idea of the cost increase of the flight ticket for the passenger over time and over deployment of SAF? And what will be the impact of this cost increase on the demand for flying? Maybe a reduction of the demand.
Yeah, so I don't have a clear value of how much the ticket prices will increase, but for sure, when we talk to a lot of airports, they expect a reduction in flying. And in the end, I think that is also a good thing for aviation emissions to have less flying. I think flying now is way too cheap. And unfortunately, I don't have the exact figures for you, but we expect to see a reduction in flying.
Would be great to have those, let's see, approximate data already in your report, in the market report, that could help also crystallize how the future could develop.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Other questions for Dusita?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for a great presentation. I was just wondering, there's a huge amount of potential feedstock coming into the world with the growing production of plastic products, which are still mainly oil-based, also a little bit bio-based. If you would make the calculations to 2050, 2060, do you believe that that could also bring a feedstock that could cover a substantial part of the SAF volumes that you need?
Yeah, so of course, now we didn't really consider, as you saw, a lot of plastics as feedstock. I think policy, is also one of the key reasons that make it very difficult to use plastic as feedstock. And I think it's hard to estimate how much will be made from plastic. And I think that depends on how the supply chain develops and what other uses of plastic there is, because the only viable SAF that can be produced from plastic is those that have no other way to be valorized. So it's really the bottom of the pit. Unfortunately, we also don't have a clear number on that either. But it's one of those things where we'll have to see how policy develops and whether there is any clear volumes that can be used from plastic.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? See, at the back you were first. No, the one behind you was first, sorry. But maybe we have...
Thank you very much for the presentation.
Yep.
There's still, chemically speaking, a problem with most of the biomass feedstocks, maybe from alkanes and the production of aromatics. Insofar I can see now, we still are very much limited to producing alkanes. How do you think we're going to solve the aromatics problem?
There is actually upcoming pathways that are dedicated to producing aromatics. So in the end, you can always blend out your fuel and you get the correct composition that you need. But also, so at SkyNRG, we work a lot with ASTM and the development of aviation fuel standards as well, and looking into the future for 100% SAF, let's say. There's two different types. There is the drop-in SAF, which is the combination of all the different pathways that keep the composition similar to conventional jet fuel. But on the other side, there is also non-drop-in SAF, where the composition may look slightly different from what conventional SAF looks like. And yeah, so Boeing is also part of the consortium member of HIGFLY. And yesterday they gave a presentation and they mentioned that by 2030, Boeing will have turbines available to use more of the non-drop-in SAF. So I think it develops in two different ways, but we'll still have to see how everything works out, because right now there is one infrastructure, and how that merges, I think that's to be seen. But I don't see that so much of an issue, because you can either blend it out or have a dedicated infrastructure for that. Yeah.
Thank you. Last question.
Actually, the same question, so it was already answered. So is it important to have aromatic and cyclohexane components in the SAF? So how do you see that?
So aromatics is important for the ring swelling in the turbines, but it also causes a lot of sooting. So generally you don't want too much of it, but you do need a small amount of it as well. However, I think there's discussions in ASTM for a while now whether, is aromatics really necessary? And there is research on whether cycloalkanes, for example, can be a replacement for the aromatics and do the same job. But in the end, I don't think there's a clear answer. And a lot of the times, if you want to put fuel into your plane, let's say they want to make sure everything works well, and they'd rather keep everything that looks the same to what they know it is. So keeping the fuel looking like conventional jet as much as possible. So in the standards, the minimum amount of aromatics is 8% and the maximum is 25%. So as long as you meet that 8%, I think that is a good number to stay in, where you reduce sooting, but you still fulfill the specifications. So to answer your question, yes, it's needed because the specification says so, but there's also developments in seeing whether there's alternatives as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's always the interesting stuff. If you start changing stuff, you also have to look at the specifications that were out there for many years.
Yeah.
Which is difficult, but you need to assess whether it's really needed.
Yeah, and I think to give a little estimate of what the ASTM process looks like, some processes take more than 10 years to go through the entire process. Because sometimes SAF production, you produce maybe this type of aromatic with this sort of branching, you don't see it in conventional jets. So what does it do to the turbines? And then, I think it's a lot of different things, a lot of different elements, making sure that everything works well in the current infrastructure. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. With that, we can close this first session. We now have a coffee break of 30 minutes. Then we'll reconvene here, and then we have the presentation of Fernanda. So I want to thank again the two great speakers. They're probably available here for questions. Let them first have their coffee, then you can probably approach them for further discussions. Thanks for now. Bye.